2021 was a whirlwind of books, and even though we're well into April of 2022, I haven't run out of outlines and things I want to talk about with some of the books I read last year. Two of my great loves were science fiction films and Gothic literature. I found a book that combines both of those together. The series is called The Pet Project. It's by Amanda Milo, and book number 1 is The Pet Project. Amanda Milo is sort of well known in the romance community. She does a lot of science fiction, alien kind of romances that are sort of in the dark romance category. This Pet Project, while it does have some explicit scenes, is definitely not a romance. There's no happily ever after. Most of what's going on in traditional Gothic nature is dark and twisted. So if you're a fan of Amanda Milo's other book series, The Pet Project may be for you if you're looking for something that's a little bit more speculative outside of that romance bubble. I couldn't put this series down once I started reading it. It was dark and there was a lot of horror elements in it, and it turned the story around on itself and made me reflect about some of the basic things I've just assumed to be fact in my own life. I just want to take a moment to go through all of the different elements that make something Gothic according to us and our Goth party, and talk about which ones applied or didn't apply to the Pet Project and why that was good or bad. So number 1, are there horror elements in this story? And I think the entire premise of the Pet Project is a waking nightmare. There's a little bit of exposition in the first story that gets us up to date with where we are in human society right now, and it's told from the perspective of aliens as opposed to a human perspective. Apparently there was first contact on Earth. They came down, weren't able to communicate with humanity, and didn't think that we were sentient, but they did think that we were some kind of domesticated pet species because we came right up to the sentient race. We were wearing clothes, weren't able to survive in the natural environment, so they quickly ended up capturing humanity and selling us off as a different pet species. And they frame this as a benevolent act, the same way someone picking a dog up off the side of the road would think they were doing something good for that dog. A horrific thing to think to start, that there are no more free humans anywhere in the world and that they don't have control over their own autonomy in any way, shape, or form. And in this story, it's sort of an interesting contrast because the reader's human and finds this situation horrific for the future of humanity, but the narrator is actually a alien scientist, so they describe it in pretty clinical terms. They're really pretty blasé about it. They would like to continue the human race because it's a very popular pet species and the human race isn't doing well. Apparently they've had a hard time figuring out temperature control and how to feed humans and how to breed them and all kinds of stuff like that. It sort of makes you think of the exotic pet trade, and we think we have a handle on what it eats and how to care for it. But when you start looking into the nitty-gritties, like if that animal gets sick, we don't know how to care for it, or if it injures itself, the surgery for exotic animals can be very difficult and the survival rate isn't very high. And of course, as far as like a breeding issue goes, obviously we think about pandas and how humans have troubles getting pandas to breed in captivity. It's not necessarily surprising that individual humans are depressed and aren't interested in raising families in alien captivity, but it is kind of interesting looking at this alien's like clinical detached view when we think about like the reality for that human being and the fate of that child if you decide to have a child in these kind of conditions versus conserving and the way we think about conserving other creatures on the planet. Even though we can put ourselves in the head of the alien and we can compare it to other things we have going on here on Earth, we can also put ourselves in the role of the humans that are there and have a loss of autonomy and feel like their horror and their helplessness and their like futile attempts to change their situation or improve it. The second tenet of Gothic horror is characters king and a deep emotional inner life. These stories are told primarily in first person. The first one is told from the alien perspective, so we got a ton of internal workings on this alien, his hopes and dreams, what he wants for humanity, how this is going to help him career-wise, him like slowly interacting with humans for the first time, getting to know their temperament as a species and their individual temperaments, helped get me set up into this frame of mind and really get to know this one alien and get invested in his one part of the story that was like telling an overall larger history of how humanity found itself in the stars. The second book is told from a distinctly human perspective, and that's pretty interesting too, because it's been several years since humans have been captured. This particular human doesn't know freedom or living on Earth or anything like that, so the kind of mindset, it sort of reminded me of the silver fox experiment and how within 8 generations of foxes they had tame foxes, and it changed like their physical features and all of that kind of stuff. So it's interesting when you remove yourself from like the human race and think about it in a breeding program domestication process. The second book with a human perspective is a little bit simpler and less complex than we see in some more standard Gothic tales. And I think that fits the character and where they are mentally and emotionally, based off of their captivity and based off of where they have been domesticated to. We get someone with a significantly more complex inner world in the third book, so I feel like it all kind of balances out. Overall, I would say that we spend a lot of time knowing what the character thinks and feels, caring about their individual journey, more than the larger fate of the world. The way the space setting takes place, there's all these different planets and worlds and alien species, it's kind of hard to feel invested in the fate of humanity as a whole. It's so large and spread out, and it feels so far out of the agency of the human beings that really you can only emotionally connect and get involved with specific individuals that we're seeing in the story. Number 3 is going to be more poetic prose. I don't feel these novellas have specifically poetic prose. They don't have a lot of flowery language or metaphor. It sort of fits here in a science fiction world to be a little bit more cold and clinical and have a few less comparisons because there's not that many Earth things to compare. So I think it probably makes sense that we don't have all those metaphors and flowery comparisons. I didn't feel any loss from not having them, and I think it would have taken me out of the prose if they had been comparing things to like bugs or giraffes or flowers here on Earth. Number 4 is going to be elements of loneliness and longing. We see a ton of this in the first book. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but there's a lot of that in the first book, and I think to a certain degree the second book explores that loneliness and longing in a different angle, and then the third book does a whole separate like finding companionship kind of story. I actually think like a alien human pet project kind of thing is a great way to explore elements of loneliness and longing, because the relationship like a sentient person has with a non-sentient creature is one way that humanity deals with loneliness and finds companionship outside of like our own species. So seeing that play out with like an alien human species is pretty interesting. Also considering like individual humans' isolation from their own kind, whether or not they can manage to find a way to connect to aliens or whether or not they can connect with other humans they find around them. All that's kind of like interesting speculative stuff, and you can apply it to different studies and different areas of research here in our current world. You guys all know I have a dog. I love my dog. I want her to be happy and well fed and safe, and I want her life to be full and for her not to be lonely. She, like many other dogs, has separation anxiety, and it's a whole different perspective on the separation anxiety to see how humans react when they're separated from specific aliens they come to see as like a friend, or maybe the only person that even sort of takes care of them or relates to them. I've always found like the dynamics inherent in a herd mentality or a social species to be really interesting. It's neat to see these dynamics play out with humans specifically, because humans don't usually consider themselves animals, and a lot of times when humans are separate or lonely, it's like by their own doing. And in this particular case, a lot of times the loneliness or the companionship that's available to them is not something that they chose. So then seeing how humans navigate that is quite interesting. Number 5 is delve into human mortality and the supernatural. So there's not like a lot about death in these stories. Sometimes the humans die, sometimes they don't. It's kind of like having a finicky exotic animal. In this first book specifically, some of the experiment protocol and some of the introduction of potential mates to each other might sort of be like exploring the death of the human species and exploring how to perpetuate that using alien technology or using artificial situations, and some of the breeding experiments we see in further books that show different augmentations of the human society. I could see how this is saying something about life finding a way and whether or not we've seen the death of the Earth species of humans, and this is the start of something new and different and changed a little bit. With the supernatural element, I would swap that entirely over to a science fiction element or a technology element. We do see different elements of technology, and they don't play a huge role, but they do play a minor role that I think is supportive and interesting in this series. Questioning a character's mental health and their reality. I would say that there aren't any characters in the story that are questioning their own mental health or their reality, but it might in a speculative way apply to the pet project because it makes readers question their own reality and their place in the world. Again, I was saying how if you put yourself in the alien's point of mind and you put your dog or you put a wild exotic animal in a zoo in the place of the humans, you can see how we might be doing the same thing to species on our own planet that these aliens are doing to humans. And the same way these aliens have good intention, humanity believes they have good intention as well, but what we're doing is still possibly not ethical. So if you're questioning your mental reality and whether or not you're doing the right thing, speculatively, that's kind of a half count. The last story too also does deal with the trauma of a specific human individual and her recovery. While it's a mental health story, it's not necessarily about her breaking from reality, which I think is core to Gothic horror. It's not necessarily all aspects of mental health that are encompassed. It's when you break from understanding the real world and you sort of go into a side realm that the Gothic nature comes in. Makes use of folklore, superstition, and myth. Originally, I didn't think the Pet Project did this, but in a weird way, it does a little bit. When the aliens are trying to figure out how to continue the human race, there's all these weird urban legends and myths and rumored whispers about how humans reproduce and the best conditions to put them in to get them to reproduce. And some of them readers are probably going to laugh at, and others readers might be horrified by. From the alien scientific point where they really don't know anything about the human race, all of them are kind of treated as maybe equally valid. I guess we'll try this. So it's not quite folklore or mythology the way that I prefer it, where we're referencing older history or where we're creating whole cloth fantasy worlds. But I would give it the urban legend half point. And then lastly, we have the strong sense of place. In the technical sense, yes, the Pet Project, each one of the locations these happen in are pretty well described. The first book, the laboratory setup, I felt like I could have walked through that lab by the time we were done describing it and working in it. And it's a pretty short story. I think it's only 10,000-ish words long. And with the second book, most of that book takes place in a series of gardens, and I kind of got a good mental image of all of the garden setups too. The third book, I had a pretty good understanding of how the house was set up, the layout there, and how different parts related to each other. So technically, yes, there was a very strong sense of place. But as far as the place becoming an actual character in its own right and having a presence or a certain feeling when you read about it, I didn't get that from any of these places. They were immersive, good world building and believable, but they weren't kind of a character in their own right. So I'm not going to qualify this for the point for the Gothic horror. So that's a Pet Project. I had a lot of fun reading it. It definitely qualifies as a Gothic science fiction. It meets 5 of the 9 points very easily, and you only need 3 to qualify. Have you guys read any science fiction stories like this? Let me know in those comments down below. And if you enjoyed listening to me talk about the Pet Project, please stop and leave a like here on the video. It really lets me know that this is the kind of literature you want me to talk about, and these are the sort of topics you want to hear more about. Thank you guys for watching. And as always, keep reading. Bye!